There's a silence that falls over a map room when the scale of a project finally outweighs the ego of its planners. By the summer of 1941, Hitler's Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, a force of nature. They'd conquered Poland in weeks, bypassed the Maginot Line, and chased the British from Europe. But here's the truth. Numbers on a page don't win wars. Sustaining 3 million men and thousands of tanks over 1,000 miles of dirt roads, that's where the invincible machine began to grind itself into dust. Today, we uncover why Hitler's greatest army was doomed long before the first snow fell. By the summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht wasn't just an army, it was a perceived force of nature. They had dismantled Poland in weeks, bypassed the impenetrable Maginot Line, and chased the British off the continent at Dunkirk. To the average observer at the time, the German war machine looked like a watch that would never lose a second. But, as any seasoned engineer or business owner will tell you, what works on a small scale often shatters when you try to 10x the operation without changing the infrastructure. This is where the myth of invincibility met the cold, hard arithmetic of the Russian steppe. You see, Hitler and his high command, the OKH, were operating under a delusion that because they had mastered the blitzkrieg in the cramped quarters of Western Europe, the same rules would apply to the East. They viewed the Soviet Union not as a sovereign power, but as a rotten structure that would collapse if they simply kicked in the front door. It's a classic mistake, confusing a fast start with a guaranteed finish. When they drew up the plans for Operation Barbarossa, the Germans brought 3 million men to the border. On paper, it was the largest invasion force in human history. But here is the green setup we must understand. Numbers on a page don't win wars. The ability to sustain those numbers over 1,000 miles of dirt roads does. The Germans were preparing for a sprint, but they had unknowingly entered a cross-country marathon through a swamp. The facts that the German leadership chose to ignore was the sheer physical geometry of the Soviet Union. Western Europe is a place of short distances and dense rail networks. Russia, by contrast, is a funnel that opens wider the further you march into it. As the German armies pushed east, their front line didn't stay compact. It stretched and thinned like a piece of rubber being pulled to its breaking point. For every mile they advanced, they had more territory to guard and fewer men to do it. History suggests that the German leadership believed the campaign would be over in 9 to 12 weeks. They were so confident in this invincibility myth that they didn't even issue winter gear to the majority of the frontline troops. Think about that for a moment. That isn't just a tactical oversight, it's a fundamental rejection of arithmetic. They calculated the fuel needed to get to Moscow, but they failed to calculate the friction of the journey. And the friction was immense. The Soviet Union didn't just fight back with bullets, they fought back with space. The Russian arithmetic of annihilation relied on a concept called strategic depth. Every time the Germans won a cauldron battle at places like Minsk or Smolensk, capturing hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers, the Soviet Union simply reached back into its vast interior and produced another army. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. We often hear about the Russian winter as the primary culprit, but the math was failing the Germans long before the first snowflake fell. By August 1941, the German tanks, the Panzers that had terrified Europe, were already wearing out. The fine silt of the Russian roads was being sucked into the engines, acting like sandpaper on the pistons. The invincible machine was grinding itself into dust because it wasn't designed for the environment it was sent to conquer. Therefore, the initial success of the invasion was actually a trap. By winning so many early battles, the Germans were lured deeper into a landscape that their logistics couldn't support. They were trading their most irreplaceable asset, experienced soldiers and precision machinery, for land that provided them no shelter and no resources. The arithmetic was simple, even if the generals refused to see it. The Germans had a finite amount of strength, while the Soviets had a near-infinite amount of space and a terrifyingly high tolerance for pain. In the boardrooms of Berlin, they spoke of Lebensraum and glory, But on the ground, the reality was a ledger that wouldn't balance. Every mile forward was a withdrawal from a bank account that was already overdrawn. As we move forward, we have to ask, if the math was so clearly stacked against them, why did they keep pushing? The answer lies in the transition from logic to desperation. But to understand that, we have to look at the man who thought he could outrun the ghost of Napoleon. This brings us to a name that haunted the maps of the German general staff like a recurring fever dream: Napoleon Bonaparte. For a generation of men who grew up in the shadow of the Great War, history wasn't just a school subject, it was a warning. But in the halls of the Reich Chancellery, the warning was treated as a challenge. There is a peculiar type of arrogance that takes hold of a leader when they begin to believe they are the exception to the rules of history. Many of us have seen this in our own lives: the man who thinks he can ignore the fundamentals of a business or the laws of physics because he's on a roll. In 1941, the German High Command was engaged in a massive act of historical denial. They were looking at the same maps Napoleon had looked at in 1812, seeing the same endless horizon, yet they convinced themselves that their technology had rendered the ghost of 1812 irrelevant. Here is a question of historical precedent. Why would a modern, industrialized army, the most sophisticated on the planet, repeat the exact mistake that destroyed the French Empire? The answer isn't found in a manual. It's found in the toxic blend of racial ideology and a "this time it's different" mentality. History suggests that the German generals, many of whom were traditional Prussian aristocrats, were deeply concerned about the lack of a deep winter strategy. They knew the story of the Grande Armée. They knew about the freezing winds and the scorched earth tactics. However, the purple payoff, the reason they proceeded anyway, was Hitler's insistence that National Socialist will could overcome material reality. He famously told his generals, "You only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." This wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was the foundation of their entire plan. They believed that because the Slavs were, in their twisted ideology, subhuman, they wouldn't have the internal fortitude to survive a lightning strike. This ideological blind spot caused them to ignore every intelligence report that suggested the Soviet Union had moved its factories behind the Ural Mountains. They sacrificed the logic of a sustained campaign for the ideology of a quick, decisive blow. Let's look at the arithmetic of the ghost. In 1812, Napoleon entered Russia with about 600,000 men. By the time he retreated, only a fraction remained. The primary killer wasn't the Russian sword, but the Russian distance. In 1941, the Germans entered with 5 times that many men, but the ratio of space to supply remained the same. You see, an army is like a living organism. It has a metabolism. It needs to eat fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The further the German organism crawled into the Russian interior, the more energy it spent just trying to stay alive, leaving less energy for the actual fight. Many of us remember the old adage, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics." The German generals were the ultimate amateurs in this regard. They allowed ideology to dictate their logistical planning. Because they knew the Soviets would collapse in 6 weeks, they decided that setting up intermediate supply depots was unnecessary. They believed they could live off the land, just as Napoleon had tried. But Russia in 1941 was not France or Poland. The purple fact here is the scorched earth policy. Stalin's orders were absolute: leave nothing for the invader. Not a grain of wheat, not a gallon of fuel, not a single shed for shelter. When the German soldier arrived in a Russian village, he didn't find a place to rest, he found a smoldering ruin. The ideology of the Blitzkrieg relied on capturing the enemy's resources to keep the momentum going. But in Russia, the faster you moved, the more nothing you captured. Think of it like a ship sailing into an ever-expanding ocean. The further you go, the more you realize that the horizon isn't a destination, it's a trap. The ghost of 1812 was whispering to them every time a supply truck got stuck in the ruts of a dirt road that didn't exist on their European-style maps. Therefore, the German army wasn't just fighting the Red Army, they were fighting the very concept of geography. They had built a machine for a sprint on a paved track, but they were trying to run it through a plowed field in a hurricane. By the time they reached the Smolensk Gate, the traditional gateway to Moscow, the ghost was no longer whispering, it was screaming. But ideology is a blindfold. Even as their casualty rates began to climb and their tank engines began to fail, the German leadership doubled down. They believed that if they could just take Moscow, the arithmetic wouldn't matter. They were gambling the entire future of their nation on a single roll of the dice, ignoring the fact that the house, in this case the Russian landscape, always wins in the end. The conflict here was between the reality of the 19th century failure and the 20th century ego. But as any of us who have lived through enough history know, the tools might change, but the terrain remains the same. The German soldier was about to learn that a panzer is just as susceptible to the cold as a cavalry horse, and a man's ideology doesn't keep him warm when the thermometer hits 40 below. This brings us to a truth that any man who has ever run a shop or managed a fleet knows by heart. You are only as fast as your slowest part. We've spent the last few chapters talking about the why and the where, but now we have to talk about the how, or more accurately, the how it failed. In the military history books, we often see those big, sweeping blue and red arrows on maps. They look clean. They look decisive. But those arrows don't show the mud, the broken axles, or the empty fuel drums. They don't show the logistics of hubris. The logistics of hubris. Therefore, the panzers ran dry. If you want to understand why the German army actually died in Russia, don't look at the casualty lists first. Look at the rail gauges. This is the ultimate green setup. To keep 3 million men moving, you need a constant, pulsing vein of supplies flowing from the rear. In Western Europe, this was easy. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had some of the most sophisticated rail networks in the world. You could load a crate in Berlin and have it in Paris in 48 hours. But here is the purple payoff, the fact that would eventually strangulate the Wehrmacht. Russia didn't use the European standard rail gauge. When the German supply trains reached the Russian border, they stopped. They literally could not go any further. Every single ton of ammunition, every liter of fuel, and every loaf of bread had to be physically unloaded from a German train and reloaded onto a Russian train, if they could find one, or onto a truck. It was a bottleneck of biblical proportions. Imagine trying to fill a swimming pool using only a drinking straw. Now imagine that pool is 3,000 miles wide and on fire. That was the reality of the Eastern Front. History suggests that the German planners knew about the gauge difference, but their hubris led them to believe they could simply capture enough Russian rolling stock to make it work. They underestimated the Soviet resolve to destroy everything as they retreated. Therefore, the Blitzkrieg, a strategy built entirely on speed, was tethered to a supply line that moved at the pace of a man walking through a swamp. Many of us remember the old mechanical rule. The more complex a machine, the more points of failure it has. The German Panzer divisions were marvels of engineering. The Panzer III and IV were precision instruments. But a precision instrument requires precision maintenance. As the panzers pushed deeper into the Soviet interior, they moved away from their specialized repair shops and their spare part depots. By the time the army reached the middle of July 1941, the arithmetic of annihilation we discussed earlier began to manifest as a mechanical crisis. A tank isn't just a weapon, it's a logistics hog. It needs specialized oils, specific filters, and high-octane fuel. But because of the rail gauge bottleneck, the German trucks, mostly civilian models seized from across occupied Europe, were being forced to carry these supplies over roads that were little more than dirt tracks. By the time a supply truck reached the front lines, it had often consumed half of the fuel it was carrying just to make the trip. It was a system of diminishing returns. The further the army advanced, the less fighting power actually reached the front. But the hubris didn't stop at the fuel tanks. It extended to the very horses that pulled the German artillery. We often forget that despite the images of tanks in the newsreels, the 1941 Wehrmacht was largely a horse-drawn army. They used over 600,000 horses for the invasion. And here is a micro-story you won't find in many textbooks. The German horses were pampered European breeds. They were strong, but they required high-quality fodder. The Russian horses, smaller and sturdier, could survive on scrub and local grass. As the German supply lines failed, the German horses began to die by the thousands from exhaustion and malnutrition. Even the low-tech part of the army was failing. When the horses died, the artillery couldn't move. When the artillery couldn't move, the infantry had no cover. When the infantry had no cover, the tanks had to stay back to protect them. The entire combined arms doctrine of the German army began to unravel, not because of a brilliant Soviet counterattack, but because of a lack of oats and grease. Now consider the human element, the trusted friend perspective. Imagine you are a German soldier. You've been told you are part of an unstoppable machine, but you haven't had a hot meal in a week. Your boots are falling apart because the ersatz leather isn't holding up to the Russian grit. You see your tanks sitting idle on the side of the road, not because they're destroyed, but because a 5-cent gasket failed and the replacement is sitting in a rail car 500 miles away at the border. The invasion of Russia wasn't lost at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943. It was being lost in the summer of 1941 in the mud of the Pripyat marshes. The panzers ran dry because the men at the top forgot that an army doesn't run on ideology, it runs on ball bearings and gasoline. The German High Command looked at a map of Russia and saw a destination. They should have looked at the map and seen a vacuum that was sucking the lifeblood out of their divisions every single day. They were so focused on the where, Moscow, that they completely ignored the how. But as the panzers sat silent and the horses lay dead in the traces, a new problem began to emerge. The Germans expected the Russian people to welcome them as liberators from Bolshevism. They expected a quick political collapse. Instead, they found an enemy that was beginning to realize that this wasn't just a war over territory, it was a war for survival. This brings us to the next critical failure. Because the Germans couldn't supply their own men, they began to seize everything from the local population. But this theft had a consequence. It turned a population that might have been indifferent into a population of partisans who would spend the rest of the war cutting the very supply lines that Germans were already struggling to maintain. The panzers ran dry, and in that silence, the German army began to hear the sound of their own end. In the world of professional ethics and craftsmanship, we often talk about the spirit of the tool. If you use a tool for a purpose it wasn't intended for, you don't just ruin the project, you often break the tool itself. The German Wehrmacht was a tool designed for professional military conquest. But in the summer of 1941, the leadership in Berlin decided to use that tool for something far darker, a Vernichtungskrieg, or a war of annihilation. Hitler didn't just want to defeat the Soviet military, he wanted to erase the Soviet people. He issued the Commissar Order, which commanded his troops to execute political officers on the spot. He suspended military law for crimes committed against civilians. The plan was to starve 30 million people to make room for German settlers. By treating the Russian people as subhuman and giving them no alternative but death, the Germans inadvertently solved Stalin's greatest problem. They gave the Soviet people a reason to fight that was more powerful than their fear of the Kremlin. Before the invasion, the Soviet Union was a fractured, terrified society. Stalin's purges in the late 1930s had decimated the officer corps and left the peasantry in a state of simmering resentment. Many of us who study the era know that in the first few weeks of the war, there were actually Russian villages that greeted the Germans with bread and salt, the traditional signs of welcome. They thought anyone would be better than Stalin. However, the reality of Nazi socialist ideology quickly turned that welcome into a bloodbath. The SS and the Einsatzgruppen followed directly behind the frontline troops. Their mission wasn't to secure the rear, it was to cleanse it. They began mass executions and the systematic seizure of all food supplies. Now, imagine the logic of a Russian farmer in 1941. You hate the Soviet commissar who took your land, but you see that the German soldier is here to take your life. Therefore, the enemy of your enemy is no longer your friend. He is a monster that must be destroyed at any cost. This shift in the civilian mindset is what created the partisan movement, a ghost army that lived in the forests and spent every night blowing up the very rail lines we discussed in the last chapter. History suggests that the Germans expected the Soviet state to shatter like glass, but as any structural engineer knows, some materials actually get stronger under pressure. The brutality of the Vernichtungskrieg acted as a hardening agent. It transformed a war of politics into a great patriotic war. While the Germans were busy brutalizing the population in the West, Stalin was realizing that he didn't need to worry about a revolt at home anymore. The people were united by a singular, desperate goal: survival. This allowed Stalin to pull his elite, winter-hardened divisions from the Mongolian border and rush them towards Moscow. The paradox was complete. By trying to make the war as total and brutal as possible, the Germans stripped away any chance of a negotiated peace or a political collapse. They forced the Red Army to fight with a no-retreat fanaticism. In the Battle of Smolensk, German officers wrote home in shock. They described Russian soldiers who, out of ammunition, would charge tanks with nothing but shovels or their bare hands. This wasn't because they loved communism, it was because the Germans had made it clear that surrender meant a slow death in a prisoner of war camp. The purple fact is horrifying. Out of the 3.3 million Soviet POWs captured in 1941, over 2 million would be dead by the following spring. Word of this treatment filtered back across the lines. Therefore, the Soviet soldier stopped surrendering. He fought for every inch of dirt, every cellar, and every ruined barn. The trusted friend perspective here is simple. If you back a man into a corner and tell him his family is marked for death, you shouldn't be surprised when he fights like a demon. The German high command, blinded by their racial ideology, failed to account for this basic human truth. They saw the arithmetic of annihilation only as something they would inflict on others. They didn't realize that annihilation is a two-way street. For every village the Germans burned, 10 more partisans joined the fight. For every commissar they executed, 1,000 soldiers vowed never to lay down their arms. The Germans were winning the battles, but they were losing the war for the soul of the territory. They were occupying a graveyard, and the ghost of 1812 was being joined by millions of new, angry spirits. By the time the autumn rains began to turn the Russian soil into the Rasputitsa mud, the German army was exhausted, not just physically, but morally. They were realizing that this wasn't the clean, professional war they had been promised. It was a meat grinder, and the arithmetic was starting to favor the side that had the most meat to give. As we look at the maps today, we see the lines moving, but between those lines there was a fire of resistance that no blitzkrieg could extinguish. The German army was essentially trying to put out a forest fire by throwing more wood to it. The Vernichtungskrieg wasn't just a moral failure, it was a strategic catastrophe. It turned the Soviet Union into a monolithic force of vengeance. And as the first frosts of October began to harden the mud, that vengeance was starting to look toward the West. In the trades, we have an old saying, it's not the heavy lifting that breaks you, it's the footing. You can have the strongest crane in the world, but if the outriggers are set in silt, the whole thing is coming down. By September 1941, the German Wehrmacht, the most sophisticated crane in military history, was about to lose its footing. We often focus on the Russian winter as the great equalizer, but that's a bit of a historical shortcut. The real killer of German momentum wasn't the ice, it was the Rasputitsa, the season of no roads. In Western Europe, a road is a permanent fixture, stone, macadam, or packed gravel. But in the Soviet Union of 1941, outside of the few arteries leading to Moscow, a road was simply a suggestion. It was a strip of dirt across the steppe. When the autumn rains arrived in October, the chemistry of the Russian soil changed. This wasn't the mud you find in a backyard. It was a thigh-deep, viscous slurry that the Germans aptly named General Mud. Imagine a 20-ton Panzer III trying to navigate a landscape that has the consistency of wet concrete. The belly of the tank would bottom out, the tracks would spin uselessly, and the engine, already strained by the dust of summer, would scream until it seized. During the height of the Rasputitsa, the German advance slowed to a crawl of just 2 or 3 miles a day. But it's the therefore that matters here. Therefore, the consumption of fuel tripled while the distance covered plummeted. To move a single division just 10 miles required more gasoline than a 100-mile dash across France would have. The logistics of hubris we discussed earlier was now being strangled by the very earth itself. Many of us remember the feeling of trying to work against a deadline when everything seems to be breaking. That was the German experience in October 1941. The soldiers were exhausted, their uniforms were caked in a gray-black sludge that never dried, and the false hope began to set in. Why false hope? Because in late October the rains stopped and the first frosts arrived. The ground hardened. To the German generals, this looked like a gift from Providence. The panzers could move again. The wheels were back in motion. But this was the ultimate trap. The hardening of the ground wasn't a sign that the environment was relenting. It was the final door slamming shut. You see, the German leadership mistook a change in weather for a change in fortune. They pushed their men to one last effort to take Moscow. They believed that if they could just see the spires of the Kremlin, the war would end. But as anyone who has ever worked a long shift knows, second winds are often just the body's way of burning the last of its reserves. The fact that haunts this chapter of history is the state of the German horse. We mentioned them before, but during the General Mud period, the horses were the only things that kept the army from stopping entirely. They were worked until their hearts literally burst. By the time the ground froze, the Wehrmacht had lost over 100,000 horses. They were replaced by nothing. The artillery was being left behind in the frozen mud because there was nothing left to pull it. The trusted friend perspective here is to look at the eyes of the men. By November, the German soldier was no longer the confident Superman of June. He was a man who had seen his friends disappear into the mud, seen his equipment fail, and was now feeling a chill in the air that his summer tunic couldn't block. The false hope of autumn led the Germans into an extreme vulnerability. They were at the very tip of a supply line that was 700 miles long, sitting on ground they didn't understand, waiting for a winter they hadn't prepared for. They thought they had defeated General Mud, not realizing he was just the scout for General Winter. The German high command looked at the frozen ground and saw a highway to victory. A more humble leadership would have looked at that same ground and seen a tomb. They had traded their last bit of operational flexibility for a few miles of frozen dirt. They were now committed to a battle of attrition in an environment where they possessed zero advantages. Here is the point for our understanding here is the realization that the Germans weren't beaten by the weather alone. They were beaten by their refusal to respect it. They treated the Russian climate as an inconvenience rather than a combatant. As the sun began to set earlier and earlier over the Russian plains, and the thermometer began its steady, terrifying crawl towards zero, the false hope vanished. In its place came the realization that the arithmetic of annihilation was about to be calculated in human frostbite.
In the world of high-stakes construction or heavy industry, there is a phenomenon known as the final inch. It's that point in a project where the goal is technically within sight, but the equipment is spent, the crew is hollowed out, and the structural integrity of the entire operation is held together by nothing but frayed nerves. In December 1941, the German Wehrmacht, the most sophisticated crane in military history, was about to lose its footing. For the men standing in the frozen ruts of the road to the Kremlin, Moscow wasn't a city anymore. It was a mirage, a flickering promise of warmth and an end to the war that receded further away with every step they took toward it. Hitler and his generals believed that the Soviet Union was a bleeding man who only needed one more shove to collapse. They funneled every remaining tank, every functional truck, and every shivering battalion into a final pincer movement to encircle the Russian capital. They believed that by capturing the hub of the Soviet rail system and the seat of Stalin's power, the arithmetic of annihilation would finally resolve in their favor. However, the reality was that the German army was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a collection of walking ghosts. History suggests that by late November, many German divisions were at less than 50% of their established strength. The invincible panzers were down to a handful of operational vehicles per regiment. But the most damning fact, the one that turned the gates of Moscow into a mirage, was the thermodynamic limit.
You see, at 30 degrees below zero, the laws of physics change for a soldier. We often talk about the cold as an abstract discomfort, but at these temperatures, it becomes a physical barrier. The German synthetic rubber tires shattered like glass. The standard lubricant in their Mauser rifles turned into a sticky glue, meaning a soldier would pull the trigger and hear nothing but a dull thud. To start a tank engine, crews had to build small bonfires directly under the oil pans for hours, a beacon that told every Soviet scout exactly where they were. The closer the Germans got to Moscow, the weaker they became. It was a perverse inverse of military logic. Usually, as you approach your objective, your power concentrates, but here, the friction of the North was stripping the Wehrmacht of its ability to function. In early December, a reconnaissance battalion of the 258th Infantry Division actually reached the suburb of Himki, just 5 miles from the city limits. They could see the gold domes of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But they couldn't move an inch further. Why? Because the mirage of a quick victory had ignored the fact that while the Germans were exhausted, the Soviets were just beginning to breathe. The German soldier was wrapping his feet in newspaper and stolen Russian shawls to prevent gangrene. Stalin was unleashing 20 fresh elite divisions from the Far East. These men were equipped with sheepskin coats, felt Valenki boots that could withstand 40 below, and the T-34 tank, a machine designed with wide tracks specifically to float over the snow that was currently burying the German panzers. The German generals were stunned. Their intelligence had told them the Red Army was spent, but they had failed to account for the human arithmetic. For every Russian soldier the Germans killed, the Soviet Union's vast, desperate interior produced 2 more. On December 5, 1941, the mirage finally vanished. The temperature dropped to a record-breaking low, and the Red Army launched its counteroffensive. The trusted friend perspective here is one of sobering clarity. The Germans didn't stop because they were outfought in a single grand battle. They stopped because they had reached the absolute limit of what biological and mechanical systems can endure. They were like a car that had been driven at 100 miles per hour in first gear for 6 months. The engine didn't just stall, it disintegrated. Therefore, the gates of Moscow represent the exact moment where the myth of Western European superiority died in the snow. The German soldier realized that he wasn't just fighting an army, he was fighting a continent that refused to be conquered. The reward for our understanding is the realization that the German defeat wasn't a sudden event in 1945, but a mathematical certainty reached in the woods outside Moscow in 1941. The retreat that followed was the beginning of the end. The invincible army was forced to turn its back on the city it had sacrificed everything to reach. As they trudged westward, the ghost of 1812 finally caught up to them. The road back was littered with the very things they thought would save them: high-tech tanks that wouldn't start, precision rifles that wouldn't fire, and the bodies of men who had believed an ideology could keep them warm. The mirage was gone. What remained was a 3-year-long death crawl back to Berlin. When a machine is pushed past its yield point, it doesn't just stop working. It undergoes a structural change. It becomes brittle. It warps. For those of us who have spent years maintaining complex systems, we know that once that threshold is crossed, you can never truly fix it. You can only manage its failure. By the time the calendar turned to 1942, the German Wehrmacht had crossed its yield point. The retreat from Moscow wasn't just a tactical withdrawal, it was the beginning of a 3-year-long slow-motion collapse that would eventually stain the honor of a generation and leave an entire continent in ruin. In the first 6 months of the war, the German soldier believed he was part of a crusade that would reshape the world. He was told that his sacrifices would be brief and his victory would be eternal. But as the arithmetic of annihilation turned against them, the nature of the war changed. It was no longer about conquest, it was about the desperate, grinding reality of holding on to a tiger by its tail. The long retreat was the most expensive period in military history. Most people think the war ended because the Germans were beaten in one go, but the truth is more mechanical. History suggests that from 1942 to 1945, the German army was essentially an organization that was consuming itself to stay alive. They began to lose their most precious resource, the experienced NCOs and junior officers who were the grease in the gears of the military machine. Every time a veteran sergeant died in a frozen foxhole in the Arzew salient or the Don Basin, he was replaced by a teenager or an old man who had been rushed through 6 weeks of training. Therefore, the total quality management of the German army, its famous Auftragtaktik or mission-type tactics, began to fail. The trusted friend knows that you can't run a master-class operation with apprentices, no matter how much will they have. Many of us remember the images of the bombed-out cities of Germany, but the stained honor part of this story happened in the mud of the East. As the retreat accelerated, the German army's behavior became more desperate and more criminal. They transitioned from a professional military into a predatory force. They burned every village they left. They executed anyone they suspected of helping the partisans. They became the very monsters their propaganda had warned them about. The fact here is the destruction of the rear. By 1943, the German retreat had become so chaotic that they began to lose more equipment to mechanical failure and lack of fuel than to enemy fire. For every tank destroyed in the legendary Battle of Kursk, 3 were abandoned on the side of the road because a simple fuel pump couldn't be delivered through the partisan-infested forests. It wasn't just a loss of territory, it was a ruin of a nation's soul. When the German soldiers finally crossed back over their own borders in 1945, they weren't bringing back glory, they were bringing back a legacy of failure that had started the moment they ignored the arithmetic of 1941. Think of the long retreat as a bridge that was designed to hold 10 tons but was forced to carry 50. The bridge doesn't fall all at once. First, the bolts shear, then the girders twist. Finally, the concrete crumbles. By the time the Red Army reached Berlin, the German bridge had been a hollow shell for years. Therefore, the invasion of Russia didn't just destroy an army, it destroyed the very concept of the German state as a world power. It was a lesson in the dangers of ignoring the physical limits of the world, the limits of geography, the limits of logistics, and the limits of human endurance. As we look back on this history from our vantage point today, we can see the ghost of 1812 standing alongside the ruins of the 1941 Panzers. It serves as a reminder to all of us who value logic and craftsmanship. No matter how shiny the machine or how bold the plan, if the math doesn't add up, the project will fail. The German army in Russia was a masterfully built engine that was run into a brick wall by a driver who didn't believe in physics. And as any of us who have ever had to clean up a mess like that knows, the rebuilding takes a lot longer than the destruction.
As we look back at the ruins of 1812 and 1941, it's a reminder that no amount of technology can replace the fundamental laws of logistics and human nature. Many of you watching have spent decades managing businesses, maintaining machinery, or leading teams. You know better than anyone that once the arithmetic of a project fails, no amount of will can save it. If you found this deep dive into the mechanics of history valuable, I'd be honored if you'd join our community. Please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this story with someone who appreciates the weight of history. I'm also curious to hear your perspective. In your own life or career, have you ever seen a sure thing collapse because the logistics were ignored? Leave a comment below. I read as many as I can, and your insights add a layer of wisdom to these discussions that the textbooks often miss. Until next time, thank you for your time.